Okay.
No, I was finished anyway, so.
Okay. All right. So let me hear from Jill and Kevin, and then let me try to make sense of where I think we are, because I'd like to get us into the small groups if we can. And so Jill, go ahead.
Well, I'll go after Kevin. I think want to hear from him first.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So I kind of wanted to, I mean, the reason we're having this group together is because we know there are some opposing views on trapping and trap check intervals. So, you know, I'm really not wanting to weigh in on any kind of who's right and who's wrong. And I think, Bob, in answer to, you know, denying basic needs, depriving basic needs, that's a very emotional question that you're asking there. But in all regards, it's, you know, in the state of Oregon, like every other state, trapping is an allowed activity. So the whole intent of having Bryant present was to look at what determines when trapping is going to occur to balance animal welfare. And there is a number of different studies. There is adaptive work that's been done throughout a number of years to address that. And I think it's important to realize from that side there, it's a little bit different question, certainly, than saying you're intaking an animal at a rehab facility. We all don't know exactly what that animal feels when it gets there, when it's in a cage for a day, a week, a while. I mean, we have all those same issues, and that's why those levels of care are different in some circumstances and under certain permits. But I think in regards to what this group is looking for, you really are trying to address when an animal is in a trap, and that trap varies across all the different types that we've been talking about. What are the balances for animal welfare that need to be taken into place and have been in consideration? And the group wants to talk about making changes to what those might be. And in this circumstance, it's really about the trap check interval for specific traps. So, and I'm trying to stay, you know, on the sidelines, you know, we're kind of on purpose a little bit, because I think it's good for the group to have that dialogue.
Jill?
Yeah, this is an interesting discussion. I would like to hear from Brian White, but I also agree with Bob Salinger about there being particular standards that certainly rehabbers have to meet, and as well as anybody who's got an animal. There's people arrested every day for misuse of animals. So, but I am interested in hearing the presentation, as well as if Colin Gillen has information he would be able to share. And as I mentioned in a previous meeting, that Oregon State University veterinary group may have somebody who's also experienced in maybe taking care of animals that have been in traps, dogs or whatever. So that's kind of what I'd like to move forward with.
Okay, thanks for that, Jill. Go ahead, Quinn, and then I'm going to try to sum up where I think we are.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond or maybe seek a little bit more clarification from about something that Kevin said. What I think I heard you say about the you know, regulations that apply to rehabbers is, you know, we don't know what an animal feels or experiences when they're in a cage in a rehab facility, and that's why there's a certain level of care. So that sounds to me a bit like the precautionary principle. If there's some level of uncertainty, we err on the side of protecting the animal. So I'm wondering why that same standard is not applied here.
When I missed who you asked that question of.
I think that was, sort of to the group, but specifically in
Mhm.
response to what I think I heard or Kevin saying.
Kevin.
And then
Yeah.
Blakely.
Yeah, the whole reason, I mean, we don't have to debate whether when an animal goes intake for rehab, the entirety of its intake is to release it as a wild animal again. So that there are absolutely some other considerations, everything from pain to fluid to, all that intensive care depending on what that injury and trauma is. So it is completely a different scenario. And I didn't mean to try to misconceive what that need is when they come into a rehab facility.
But can I just ask a clarifying question, Kevin? If an animal is, if a non-target animal is caught in a leg trap or, a trap, for example, and it's the non-target animal and it hasn't suffered injuries to the extent that it, can survive. I mean, isn't that animal being released as a wild animal as well?
Yeah, and I think that's some of the balance that Brian would talk about in regards to when an animal gets into a trap, what are the opportunities to take care of some animal welfare concerns, consider injury and trauma. So if release, and we do that even for wildlife management activities where we're putting collars on and different things, certainly, release could be an option in a lot of those circumstances, just depending on the type of trap you're setting.
So just to follow that train of thought just a little bit further, and going back to what I'd talked about earlier about, if the intention of the trap is to kill the animal and the trap hasn't killed the animal, and the animal suffers, let's say minor injury, because Jim had talked about that, some of the trap technology is such that it's changed so that, a non-target animal who's caught in well, it wouldn't be a kill trap, actually, it would probably be a leg trap. But anyway, so let me just follow that train of thought. So if an animal, if the intention of trapping the animal is for predator control or fur bearing control or fur bearer benefit, regardless if it's a kill trap or a live trap, are there exemptions like Bob had talked about for the care of that animal to allow it to be released into the wild for a trapping intention versus other intention? And is that something that we need to look at in the OARs? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's not an exception to animal welfare concerns. I think what you're talking about though is it really is that's why we have some differences in trap check intervals between what type of trap you have on the landscape. And what Bob had put forward is the moment that a animal is in a trap, how is it a decision that in that trap, you're depriving it of food, water, shelter, any of those other number of things. And I think that is a base premise that Bob was starting from when you're trapping, and how is that different than when you're taking an animal into a rehab facility? So.
Now, I can speak for myself here, Kevin. I'm not suggesting that rehab and trapping are the same thing. What I am suggesting is that there are basic standards of care that recognize that you should be providing food, water, shelter, protection for an animal when you have it in custody. That is a standard set of criteria that you can find across any spectrum of situations where people have custody of wild animals. Trapping, we do make an exception for out of practicability issues. But what I'm objecting to here, Kevin, is the idea that we actually have to prove that extending the period of time that an animal is in a trap and suffering from that kind of deprivation is harmful or increases suffering over time. I'm asking the question, Kevin, do we really need to prove that an animal that's left for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days without water suffers? I think the answer is yes. I think we can stipulate that. I think an animal exposed to the elements in a fixed location for 5, 6, 7 days is eventually going to suffer more and more. I think we can stipulate that the answer there is yes. And I think that's very consistent with the rationale that you use at ODFW for requiring people with custody of wild animals to provide basic needs for the basic needs of those animals. As far as what kind of trauma occurs, I'll just say this. You know, we don't get a lot of trapped animals into wildlife rehabilitation centers, and there's a reason for that. I mean, you're not allowed to interfere with traps. People don't typically bring trapped animals to wildlife rehabilitation animal care centers. They typically kill them or let them go, but we do occasionally see them. And when we see them, the injuries are usually fairly horrific. You know, the raccoon that chewed its foot off, I've dealt with those. The Cooper's hawk that had both of its legs snapped in a trap and was still alive. I've dealt with those. The great horned owl that had its legs snapped in a trap. I've dealt with that. You know, they're awful, awful injuries when they come in. I don't think that's a surprise. If it gets brought to a rehab center, it probably has suffered a really bad injury. But you know, they are gruesome, gruesome injuries, and those animals are absolutely suffering when they come in. Again, a reason to try and, from a practicability perspective, to minimize that risk and suffering as much as possible. And all I'm getting at is, I think we need to focus there in this discussion. How do we minimize the risk and harm to these animals, the suffering these animals go through as much as possible, as opposed to debating whether animals do suffer in traps?
Yeah, and Jamie, I'll just respond real quick. I appreciate you really stating that a lot more simply, Bob, because there is no disagreement. That's what the group is trying to wrestle with. I don't think Bryant was asked to prove that, as you were saying, to prove that there could be injuries longer in trap. There's, you know, that wasn't the intent of that at all. It was tried to demonstrate how the BMPs and how traps are designed. It was to open up that conversation. But I agree with you in regards to what the next task is for the group, is to talk about those lengths of time. The other thing I want to highlight, Bob, and you have to be careful of highlighting illegal activities as traumatic injuries that come into a rehab center or across our districts or into our veterinary office. Trapping raptors with snap traps on type of fence posts is illegal activity, and you really can't reflect that as a trapping activity.
We've seen both illegal and trap. You know, we've had raptors trapped in traps on the ground too. So I mean, again, not a whole lot of that, because it's not a common cause of intake at our facility at all. So I don't want to misportray that. But when we do get them in, and in some cases they're traps that were set legally, in other cases that traps that were not. So you know, there are non-target species caught in traps, and you know, it's just a reality.
Okay, Tyler?
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in and just, you know, like Bob, you're saying that, you know, suffering is inevitable. And let's say I was to agree with you for a second, but to what extent, right? I believe we don't know. And I'd like to quantify it. And at least at a minimum, I'd like to talk to the experts who do this for a living and get their perspective, not only about this spectrum of suffering that they might expect, but also the feasibility of a study. And the thing I think we're also missing here a little bit is the trapper side of this conversation. If we're talking about animal welfare, which is very much germane to the conversation, trappers want to minimize the suffering of animals, absolutely. But we can't forget that feasibility to trap should still be a part of this conversation. So let's not forget that.
Yeah, and I think I've heard Bob and several other people talk about the practicability, you know, so there's so let me just check in with everybody here. So it's about we're going on 3:15. One of the ideas for the group today was for us to work in smaller groups to have a conversation and see what ideas were emerging. I think this discussion is really central to people's understanding about what, you know, where we're trying to get to as a group. So I think this has been a really helpful discussion. But you know, I'm just going to pose the question out here, you know, to try to, is there anybody that, I mean, because we've said this multiple times that you know, of course we want to minimize the suffering. Of course, you know, I mean, everybody wants to do that. Is there anybody that needs information that would help them to understand that animals are suffering when they're trapped? I mean, can we all agree that there's a level of suffering inherent in trapping. I mean, is that just, can we agree on that? I mean, if an animal is killed efficiently and quickly, the suffering diminishes. But I mean, just, you know, just like with hunting or fishing or, you know, I mean, there is a you know, a level of suffering. And do we need to quantify that? I'm asking this question of all of you. And Stan is leaving. I don't know where Stan's going. Go ahead, Jim.
No. There is gonna be some suffering.
Yeah.
But you gotta look at the population as a whole. You can't always look at one individual. And by not trapping, you're causing more damage to the population as a whole.
Right, and Jim, and I hear you, and I don't, you know, one thing I don't think anybody is saying, at least in this group, for this purposes of this conversation, nobody is saying that we're not going to trap. I mean, I haven't heard people say that. What I'm hearing people say is, how can we do it humanely and reduce suffering? And what does that mean to trap technology and trap times and the regulations that we have to reduce suffering and do it humanely? So, you know, people might outside of this group have, you know, particular opinions about trapping versus not, but for the purposes of this group, we're really trying to unpack that how do we minimize suffering, and what does that mean to trap technology, regulations, and the trap check time.
Trappers have done a great deal to minimize damage, you know, but you can't stop it. So
yeah. And I think so I guess my question is, so it'd be helpful to have Bryant come in and talk about the BMPs and talk about, because one of the things that Bryant, when I met with him a week or so ago, that he shared, you know, and Kevin, you can help me explain this probably better, is that, you know, he said, you know, they do monitoring research every 2 years, you know, on their trap technology, on BMPs, on certain species, and working with trappers. And they take that information back, and then they, you know, that informs trap technology, it informs training, it informs, you know, what they're asking of, you know, what they're advising states to do in terms of regulations around trapping. And so that piece, I mean, I've heard a number of people say that it would be helpful to hear more about that. You know, what are they finding and what are they doing with that information? That's separate from this question of, do we need to prove that animals suffer? So I think the question on the table is, do we need to bring a vet in, you know, who can talk with us about the physiological, psychological trauma of an animal in a trap, and how does that help us determine the length of time an animal should be in a trap? Or can we all say here that, you know, we agree that there is a level of suffering that occurs, and our charge is to minimize that through trap, you know, best practices, trap technology, training, checking traps, you know, whatever that suite of recommendations is that we need to tighten up to minimize suffering. Everyone's just looking at me blankly.
Well, I would suggest that, I don't know, you need to take a vote, or what do you need to do? I think it would help to move things along. And I think that's what you're trying to do, Jamie. If there was some agreement, then the animals suffer in traps. I think it's obvious. Just like with the beaver group, everybody agreed that, you know, about the benefit to beavers on the landscape. You know,
Right.
there was nobody's doubting that. You know, it's evident out on the land what they do. And I hear Bob saying that that it's so obvious. Why is it being debated? And why does it have to be proven? And so
that's what I'm asking is does anybody feel like that needs to be proven?
And Tyler, I hear Tyler, you're saying that there needs to be more empirical evidence for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that an animal doesn't suffer in a trap, but I'd like to know to what extent. right? And I'd like to quantify that. At least, like I said, I'm just repeating myself here, is that I'd like to, at a minimum, hear from the experts as to what they believe our path forward should be and what the feasibility is. We have no idea. I don't think any one of us here on the call has any idea what the feasibility is of a study. And I'd like to, maybe we can put this idea to bed. I don't know, but it would be nice to hear it.
So does it have to be either or? Can there be some agreement and then we make a recommendation? I mean, when there's a recommendation to the staff and the commission that there's a study that's designed? I don't know.
What would this study do? Would we leave an animal in a trap for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and then test whether its stress hormones go up, whether it becomes dehydrated, whether it loses weight? Would we do it in an area with other predators and see if it gets predated upon? I'm just trying to figure out what the study is that we're looking for that would tell us whether a prolonged stay in a trap increases suffering and risk.
Yeah.
Bob, have you read the BMPs, like the White et al.? Because
Yeah, I read the BMPs, but that's not. I'm not debating the BMPs here. I'm debating the need for a study that gets into whether an animal is suffering from prolonged periods of deprivation, and how that would influence this. Again, getting back to Jamie's question, I think we can stipulate that depriving an animal of its basic needs is not a desirable situation, and jump right to the next question, which is how can we practically minimize that risk and suffering, as opposed to does that risk and suffering occur? And I think those are very different questions. And I think that's what we were charged to do here, is to figure out how do we bring this down to the level that minimizes that risk and suffering, and still allows trapping to proceed in the state of Oregon. What is a reasonable standard within Oregon to achieve that? And obviously there's different standards to different states. So different states have arrived at different conclusions around that question.
Yeah, I think when you started that, you asked some questions that I would like to ask the co-authors of the BMPs, right? How could we measure this or this or this to get at animal welfare, right? And I'm getting the sense that we just don't want to get bogged down in a study. I mean, I do believe I'm the only one really advocating for this. I'm not sure anybody else is. And we can put it to bed if this group is not in favor of it. But I would at least like to hear from Bryant to see if what I'm looking into here is asinine, is a mistake, is not feasible. At a minimum, I think we need a presentation just to hear from the experts here. It's very much germane to this conversation.
So would people be in favor then of, I mean, Bryant we have to see if he's available to come in December, but are people in favor of having Bryant come back, or come at all, because he didn't make it, in December, talk about, I mean, some of the things I noted here is, the work that the research that they do to inform the BMPs and informing training and informing trapping technology and trap check times. And then, to have Tyler and others ask these questions about, does this exist? How would this be helpful? Those kinds of things. Is there anybody that would disagree with having Bryant come and have us have this discussion?
Yeah, I think as long as it's an additive factor, because we did have a discussion about trap check technology. We had one session on that already. And so, yeah, if there is something more that he's providing that's germane to the conversation, then, and people agree that it's helpful, then sure. I thought we had already covered that, but apparently there's more that I'm not aware of.
Susan?
Yeah, I just think if you ask a researcher, about whether or not a study is appropriate, they're going to, you know, is feasible, they're going to say yes. But I just want to point out that White, you know, a lot of the research that he looked at was, you know, first of all, they pulled animals after 24 hours. So we have to keep that in mind. And second of all, I'm just quoting the study directly. They excluded from analysis animals that were already dead or injured upon trap inspection as a result of uncontrolled external variables, such as being shot by another person, attacked by other animals, hypothermia, and accidental drowning. So I think we just need to keep in mind that framework when we're listening to his presentation. I don't view it as a holistic view of the trauma that an animal can experience in a trap. And I certainly don't think it provides any insight as to what happens to an animal after 24 hours.
Okay, thanks for that. So it sounds like then we'll move forward with having Bryant, but the question still is on the table about, you know, I mean, I asked it already once, I'm going to ask it again. I mean, you know, so Tyler, you can ask the questions about, you know, does the empirical data exist? I mean, how does Bryant White, you know, use that, or how does the trapping, you know, industry use that? I mean, do we need somebody else to come in and help and have this conversation about suffering? I mean, I'm still hearing that we're kind of on the fence about this. Greg, you had said about that it would be helpful to have a veterinarian come in.
Or, you know, and the presentation that we had before about trapping technology was provided at the goal to talk about how suffering is minimized. And so that's where Bryant is going to come from.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's what we need to hear more about, I don't know that we do. I mean, I got a better idea about it. You know, Jim showed his traps. Someone talked about some of the emerging technology. Derek talked about it quite a bit, about, you know, these things are starting to be introduced more kind of in the research and design phase. It's not mainstream by any means, you know, that Jim is kind of an exception. And so you know, maybe since I started out with not a lot of knowledge and I thought I gained a lot, I thought that we kind of had that. But I do think that, you know, the original intent was to have, it doesn't have to be a veterinarian, because, you know, there's animal physiologists that, you know, they have the same information. But I also agree that it's just a given that it's same with people. You know, you don't eat, you don't drink, you're out exposed in the cold, in the elements, there's suffering. There's no, it's not a debatable kind of thing. And the longer you do without, the worse off you are. So it's kind of baffling that there's just, everybody's just not, yeah, that's true. You know, I don't quite understand why it's like people are pondering this. It's kind of baffling to me.
Well, and that's why I've asked the question now 3 times to try to see where we are with this and how much information, you know, more we need to share, because it sounds like where we agree. So, you know, I want to make sure everybody hears, and I see that Stan has gone. I don't know, you know, where he left, but it's not, you know, we're not talking about stopping, you know, we're not talking about stopping trapping. We're talking about minimizing suffering in how trapping is done in Oregon. And I think we can agree that that's what we're trying to do here. Is there anybody that disagrees with that as a basic premise?
It's why the committee was formed.
Right,
Otherwise,
I know, but I'm just,
none of us would be here if that question didn't come up to our commission. That's why all these people are in these little boxes here talking about this. I don't know what I hope we're not going backwards.
I hope we're not either, but yeah, I'm just trying to put to bed this question about, you know, the suffering piece. Kevin?
Yeah, I'm not raising my hand to say that I disagree with the statement. I was just going to actually just respond to your question and the statements that have been brought up. And I think I'd say I can agree that there is a potential for animals, the longer that they go without the resources they need, whether that's food, water, or shelter, that is a concern, and that is a potential to minimize their survivability. I think that's an agreeable statement, and I think there's a lot of variability in that statement. From species to species and within a species, there's variability between individuals. But I'm not going to get into how do we measure that? How do we discuss that and look at that? I think we can accept the fact that that is a potential reality. But I think that comes back to some of those points is, Jim has brought it up, is are we looking at minimizing and reducing all concern and all potential harm? And I think that's where Bob might have been alluding to, that there are some points that we have to talk about then in some of those exceptions. Are we talking about managing things at a population? Are we looking at managing things at an individual basis? Are we going to be minimizing all possible harm at an individual basis, at a population level? And I think that's where there's a lot of concern coming from various individuals, is a hesitation of where the next part of the conversation goes. But I think even the BMP discussions, they're not definitive in injury in all aspects, but that it is likely to occur. And I think that's a safe assumption. But to what degree to an individual, much like the BMPs, even though they were checked in a 24-hour basis, there was no qualifier for when the animal was captured, whether it was caught an hour before the trap was checked, or whether the animal was captured 23 hours before the animal was checked. So there's enough variability in that information. So I understand some of that concern of looking at injury scores. There was no basis for how long an animal was actually in a trap, or how much an individual animal in its uniqueness fought or struggled longer than another animal that might have been more subdued in the trap. So there's so much variability that's pretty hard to really quantify. But I think, we can recognize that there is that concern. And obviously that's what BMPs are driving to. That's what protocols or procedures, standard operating procedures, and those things are driving to, is trying to minimize those harms. But nothing in life is an absolute. And whether we're talking about trying to then minimize things down to an absolute. And I think that's the next part of the conversation that you really needs to start happening before individuals can be, open and discussing. I don't know if that's a fair statement or not.
Yeah, so Kevin, say that again. What is the next part of the conversation that needs to happen before people can be open and discussing? What do you mean by?
I think if we're talking about accepting that there is a concern for animal, injury and animal harm being restrained and trapped for long periods, I think we can agree to that the longer animal is held. How many animals are? I think this is really a question of how many animals are being inhumanely captured or restrained for prolonged periods. And that's this part of the data and the science that we don't know. And so is this group driving to try to minimize that down to zero? Are we trying to eliminate all risk, some risk, most risk? What is this group driving to? What is it we're wanting to accomplish? And I think that's where more of the concerning questions are going to come from.
I think that's actually a really interesting question, Kevin. It'd be interesting to hear everybody answer that. I'm going to hear from Bob, and then let's just go around and hear from everybody about, just sort of like that, what is the level of risk that we're, sort of what are we trying to resolve here in terms of the certainty? Bob?
It feels like we've had this conversation virtually every single meeting. I'm getting a little baffled by it. We've said that the goal is not to end trapping. We've stipulated that. Number two, we're never going to be able to avoid all risk. And so we've asked the question, what is a reasonable trap check time duration that allows trappers to continue to operate, but reduces the risk as much as possible? And, I think we keep sort of changing the question around and saying, is the risk zero? No, we settled that, I thought, a long time ago, right at the beginning. And so, from my perspective, really what we're down to is we're not debating whether we're doing trapping at all. We're debating what is practicable for trappers in terms of trap check duration, with the understanding that the more time that goes by, the more likely an animal is to suffer or be harmed by this. So, I think we need to get to that, because it feels like we've just been sort of going around all these other questions for weeks and weeks and not actually getting to that question.
Tyler?
So, yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back to it. I'm getting frustrated too, Bob, because I feel like we don't know what an interval means for animal suffering, right? We just have these ideas in our head, our emotional responses. That's why I have been an advocate for empirical data to at least give us something to stand on, because your idea of what an animal is capable of withstanding is different than mine. And that's pretty obvious. Not just withstanding, but thriving in those unfortunate conditions. I'm here trying to balance, the practice of trapping with animal welfare, but I'm not sure that we haven't already found that balance at the intervals we have. I honestly believe that. So that's where there's this disconnect here with me and where this conversation is going.
Greg?
Well, I agree that the goal has never been to eliminate all risk. You'd have to eliminate trapping altogether. I mean, the conversation is reminding me of what I'm dealing with Washington State around ESA listed fish stocks. Maybe Joe could attest to this as well. No one's saying stop fishing, right? What we're saying is, are we doing the most that we can do to protect those ESA listed stocks? Are we doing all that we can do so that they can spawn, that they can reproduce? So it doesn't mean stop fishing, but what else can the department do? Can we provide cool water refuges for fish to rest when they're returning, to the streams? So to me, it's similar. What is within the realm of our department to do the best that we can do to standardize our trap check intervals that does the most to keep animals from suffering. And that's the question that came before us. And so, no one's trying to have a zero sum suffering. That is not going to happen. We just have to do the best that we can do. And I think that's what this group is charged to do. And that's why we've been talking about this. And it does get a little circular sometimes and strays in, I think, in some directions, about, Cairo pups getting their feet chewed and by adults and things like that. I mean, I agree that there's a whole kind of a landscape ecology and population dynamics that need to be addressed and that are a part of the whole trapping paradigm. And, I agree. There's a lot of other nuances about it. But I think we need to kind of hone in on, what the question is and keep that in mind. I mean, I'm not going to, I think Jamie had asked me to talk about this at the beginning, but I'm not going to be around for these final recommendations. And, but I've asked the Chair Wall to check in with Commissioner Zarnowicz with this trap check group, and also Commissioner Hatfield Hyde with our Beaver group, to help to make sure that, we're staying on track, from our commission side. But I'm going to be wrapping up after this meeting toward the, this is my last month.
Jill, thanks for that, Greg. Jill?
Yeah. The department deals with risk all the time. And when we set hunting seasons, we have a general idea of what the population is, but we're not out there counting every animal. And we set tag limits, and we expect a certain percentage of those tags to actually be filled. We don't expect 100% of the animals to be killed. If that were the case, we probably wouldn't have as many tags. So what we're dealing with with trap check times is trying to find a reasonable amount that is both reasonable for the animal and reasonable for the trappers. And I don't agree that we need research. That came up also in the beaver management group, and a lot of people turn to research, more research, but I think both groups have a lot of information that they have heard and can work with to put up some recommendations. And we may be completely, far apart from 1 month check or never checking, down to checking every day. So, but we need to go there and start working through those recommendations, I would say, rather than trying to rely on very specific information that would take years to get. And maybe, as somebody mentioned, maybe it was Quinn, might be unethical to just be leaving an animal out there and checking on it to see how it's feeling every day. So, that's what a department, any agency like this has to deal with is risk, and that we have as much information as we can get to make decisions. They're never going to be perfect.
Let me share my screen. So this is what it looks like. I mean, I feel like we've been circling around this, and I understand that there's uncertainty about, what recommendations could be. But I mean, this group you are in the driver's seat to come up with the recommendations to address these issues. And so, when I peel away everything what I've heard here in this last hour and a half of conversation, I hear an agreement that we're not ending trapping. I hear that we want to allow trapping to continue to reduce risk to animals and is practicable for trappers, that we can't reduce all risks, and that what we should do all we can to minimize animal suffering. So those are the things that I'm hearing from, through this last conversation. And I guess what I'm struggling with is, I don't know why, if people are saying these things, pretty much everybody is saying these things. And so I guess I'm not sure why we can't agree to these so that we can start talking about what the recommendations are to help achieve it. And so that's the piece where I'm a little bit stuck with all of you. And so that's what I'm asking for is, first of all, did I get this right? Are these the things that we agree on? And if not, why? And are we ready to start putting some ideas out there that begin to address these? Anybody want to?
Could people do thumbs or something?
Quinn? Yeah, we could call for a vote.
I think the only thing that's missing for me is, the explicit statement that animals do suffer in traps, right? That's sort of a right here, we have not ending trapping as sort of your foundational statement, but paired with that should be animals do suffer in traps. And then we go to these other pieces. But I think what's missing is can we have a vote or call the question in some way that we can respond concretely? Because I feel like there's this awkward thing where we all now have to be like, yes, no.
Yeah.
Or,
Well, why don't we just do like kind of a roll call and hear from everybody?
I think you're gonna have to, Jamie, you're gonna have to call people out name
Yeah.
by name if you want that to happen, because there's a lot of crickets.
Can we add to this that we don't know, and insert any metric you want, but we don't know animal welfare, insert metric with the current trap check intervals that we have?
Say that one more time.
Frame that however you want, but the premise of what I'm saying here is that we don't know as to the animal welfare of our current trap check intervals, right? We don't know. And I think everybody could agree with that as well.
We don't know the extent of animal suffering based on.
That sounds great. Based on injuries or other body condition metrics.
With our current regulations. So. Bob, you unmuted. Were you going to say something?
No, I'll wait for you to go around and ask people.
Yeah. Okay.
Does
So-
that mean that, just clarifying last name, does that mean we don't know the extent based on what our current regulations are? Is that what you mean, Tyler? That our current regulations don't stipulate what the extent of animal suffering is, or?
I'm saying we don't know the current state of animal suffering on average that occurs with our current regulations. We have ideas as to what occurs in terms of injury with 24-hour trap check intervals, but we have this hole in this data gap for what we are currently doing.
Okay, well, let's pause on, what I'm going to have to do is, I'm going to put this in the chat because I can't see everybody. It's one of the, I just wish we were in a room with a whiteboard. Let's see here. So I have to stop share and I've got to stick it in the chat so that we don't forget what I wrote up there. And then I'm just going to go around based on, and so it all should be there. Okay. So that's what I wrote on the whiteboard. So I'm just going to pick folks. So let's go ahead and start with Susan.
Can you read, excuse me, can you read what are we voting on each line that you wrote?
No, I want to get a thumbs up, thumbs down about, this basic set of what I think we agree to, which is that we're not ending trapping, animals suffer in traps. I put it in the chat, Jill, or.
I know you did, but.
Bianca, can you share your screen with it? Can you take it out of the chat and put it on a Word doc and stick it on the screen?
Yes, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Well, some of those things might be kind of opposite of each other. So if we vote on the whole package, then if we vote no, that doesn't mean we reject everything in it. I'd rather vote on each one.
Okay.
I mean, some of that, like, we're not stopping trapping, that's already been decided. I think the group has already agreed on that.
Okay, well, let's do a vote. Are we not stopping trapping? A thumbs up if we're not stopping trapping. And just see around the room, everybody put your thumbs up physically, look. Is there anybody that's not weighed in? Okay, so we've agreed to that. So the next one, animals suffer in traps. Thumbs up, I mean, everybody put a thumb up if you agree with that. And if you don't, then, so who didn't put their thumb up?
Yeah, this is Kevin. And I didn't put my thumb up because I think it's a it's a word that in, the word suffer is just a word that everybody's going to have their own definition to. So I almost want to put it in more simple terms. I think everybody would agree that, animal welfare is important to consider in what we're doing.
I think that's
Agree with,
just,
I
that's
agree with
sort of,
that.
I think that's sort of obvious. I don't think it replaces that sentence. Um,
And the only reason I said that, Greg, was because I think when Quinn made the suggestion, it right away elicited a response from Tyler to deal with what he wanted to interpret suffering to mean. So
Yeah, I see what you mean, Kevin.
yeah,
So what if we,
just a suggestion.
so what if it said animals suffer in traps? Animals suffer in traps, and we want to reduce the suffering. I mean, that's what you want. That's what you want to do, right?
well, we have that sentence in there already.
I would not say reduce, I'd say minimize.
Yeah, so we have that. So let's move on to the next one. Allow trapping to continue to reduce risk to animals and is practicable to trappers. Thumbs up and keep them up so everybody can see if you agree with that statement. Bob, your thumb's not up. Up there it is. Okay.
I guess, sorry, I'm confused by the sentence.
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, I agree. I put my thumb up, but I think what you're trying to say is allow trapping to continue in a way that reduces risk to animals, but is also practical for trappers.
Mhm, yeah.
Yeah, it just needs to be clarified.
I mean, I would say reduce, adjust regulations to reduce suffering to the maximum extent practicable.
Well, that would need another thumb vote. Some people, I think there's some people that want to keep it the way it is and not make any adjustments. I've heard that during our meetings. So, we may have to check in with folks on that.
So given how it's written now, allow trapping to continue in a way that reduces risk to animals, but is also practicable to trap for trappers. Does that make a difference, Lauren and Brian?
Well, it makes more sense, but I mean, I guess I just don't know if I'm ready to completely weigh in.
Okay, well, that's what we're trying to gauge right now, is we're trying to, I mean, we're clearly stuck, I mean, because, and we're trying to figure out how to get unstuck. And so figuring out where we agree and where we don't agree is one way to help us get unstuck, because we've got to get to recommendations, and we can't get to recommendations if we're still debating whether or not animals suffer in traps. And so that's what we're trying, so that's what we're trying to resolve here is, just figure out what are the statements that we, agree to, so that we can start to get to some recommendations. Quinn, your hand was up and then it's down.
I keep raising it and lowering it. I think, we combined, animal suffer in traps. Therefore, we should do all we can to reduce or minimize animal suffering. Here, it seems like this one rightly goes with not ending trapping. We're talking about allowing trapping to continue in a way that reduces, it goes with the top statement. It's really just one thing.
Yeah, so I think it's getting rid of the not ending trapping, and then it's just one statement. I mean, basically you guys are, committee drafting a value statement. Brian?
I just want to say, I think Commissioner Woolley's right. When we consider all the voices that we're hearing, one of the words that's going to be a struggle here is the reduces. And I think there might be members of the group that want to consider the risk to animals, but maybe aren't ready to say that a change needs to happen yet. So if we're looking for a full consensus on this statement, I'm not sure we're quite there with reduces versus considers, and minimizing becomes the same trap for us as a word is, well, we agree that we can't eliminate all risk. And so when we talk minimize, well, how close does that come to eliminate? So those are some words that I think we're struggling with.
Okay, and I don't want to jump ahead of you, Kevin Christensen, but just, so we would need to continue to go down the line, in other words, to find out, because, I did hear that, that some folks are, want to keep the status quo. And so those folks should speak up now, if that's what their feeling is, so that we know whether or not we have consensus on this one or not.
Mhm.
Yeah, not to jump off topic, and I'm sorry to jump in out of turn here, but the allowing trapping to continue is a sticky one for me, because I wasn't aware this committee was looking at whether or not we were going to continue trapping or not. It seemed pretty obvious to me that we were, so it seems unnecessary.
So continue trapping and instead of allow, just say, right?
Yeah.
Just
Continue
continue
trapping in a
trapping.
way that reduces, right? Would that sound better?
Yeah,
Tom?
and Tyler, I'll push back a little bit on that, because it continues to come up that there's this concern that this sort of underlying issue is that we want to ban trapping. And I think you've heard, we want to put that to bed, and that you've heard over and over from people on this group that, when they start to talk about reducing suffering and, to the extent practicable for trappers, reducing animal suffering, they're not talking about stopping trapping. And so I think that's why, we wanted to have that really clearly in there. You heard Bob say it, you heard people say, trapping will continue, and we want to do it in a way that reduces suffering to animals and is practicable for trappers.
Yeah. I can see how that word allow, though, Tyler, is kind of a trigger. As if
It's semantics to me. I don't.
Yeah. As if it's being debated, and we're not debating that. And so, I would suggest continuing trapping in a way that reduces, as opposed to the word allow. I know you're trying to really underscore allow, Jamie, to put that to bed, but right before that, it says not ending trapping. So it's stated there.
Yeah.
Already.
Okay.
So, just so that folks are, comfortable with the language.
Right. Brian, your hand is still up. Did you have something else? Kevin?
Yeah, I was going to just mention on that, all we can do when ODFW and their wolf plan, and they looked at the reasonable things that individuals need to implement, non-lethal methods to try and alleviate conflicts. They didn't look at all methods. They needed to be reasonable methods, because, just because fencing might be an option, it may not be a feasible option. And every time I see the word all, I kind of go, and that's an example, is that not all things may be feasible or practical or applicable. But, there are certain things, that we can do that are reasonable to consider. And I don't know how that plays in the word, we're trying to finesse and put the whole sentence together. But that's, something that's an immediate flag to me when you describe all. Because that's one of those qualifiers we said we can't do all things.
Yeah, it's kind of on how you look at the sentence. All we can do means that there are things that we can't do. That's how I read it. But you could say all we can reasonably do, if that, puts a little more, feels like more wiggle room in it, we can do that. But when I say all we can do, it doesn't mean every possible thing under the sun. It means trying to do things that could work. So I don't know. A lot of words.
Bianca, yeah, a lot of wordsmithing, but clearly every word has meaning, to people, and that's what we're really trying to get unstuck. And so Bianca, if you can get rid of the word allow before trapping, and if you can add reasonable under the we should do all we can do that is reasonable. Bob?
Yeah, I guess, Jamie, I feel like there's an elephant in the middle of the room here, which is, I think some issues are amenable to committees like this and some are not. And I think the fact that we're doing this now, which is the kind of thing you do either before or
Yeah.
at the very first meeting, is indicative of the fact that we've made pretty much no progress at this point. I think there are fundamental differences on the side of this issue and not a lot of incentive to find common ground. I just am not seeing that. What I'm seeing is, us wordsmithing and going back to foundational questions like, are we trying to ban trapping? And I really wonder if this is going to be a productive committee at this point, or whether there needs to be a different approach where ODFW brings forward a proposal, gets public input, and makes some decisions. And I say that with very little confidence that ODFW will bring forward a proposal that the environmental community will see as appropriate. But I also don't see a point in kind of spending a lot of hours debating wordsmithing mission statements, 6-7 meetings into a process.
Quinn?
Yeah, I think the commission is going to have a very challenging rulemaking ahead of itself regardless. I think the hope for this group is that we could make it as painless as possible and bring up something that represented some sort of foundation for the commission to stand on, but they were still going to have probably a very challenging public process. On the way this is going, I think we're getting a preview to it. So I sort of feel the same. Let's get to it. Let's either put up, a handful of proposals representing the different viewpoints and let the commission get to its job, which we know is going to be tough. And let the commission weigh in, let all of the people, let all the stakeholders weigh in, as we know they're going to, and we know they're going to have the right to do through the public process anyway.
Kyle?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I know I'm alternate here today. I was just going to try and articulate maybe some of the perspectives so people can get it. I'm not sure I'm ready to go as far as Bob in that it's completely broken. What I think Tyler and others are trying to articulate is that some of these statements feel like one-way ratchets, and I'm not sure we've looked at the questions correctly. Like if we as a group collectively sat and looked at each one of the intervals and said, where are we at on the 48-hour relative to this? We might haggle around that a little bit and go, okay, let's park that one. Where are we at on the 30-day, right? And then we can talk a little bit about what room exists in there. If we just automatically are trying to ask everyone to say this and that, and that's automatic, it becomes, it's a boa constrictor. And so I don't know if I'm saying that in a way that makes any sense, Jamie. I'm just not sure that we've gotten to the meat of things that we really could all agree on.
Yeah, no, it's really clear. We haven't. And so, I think there are I thought that there would be some basics that the group would agree on, but it's pretty clear that they're underlying. I mean, there's just so much uncertainty underlying where everybody's coming from that, it's folks are just hedging their ability to fully participate, if you will. So here's what I would suggest. Here we are at 4:00. We need to end the meeting. This is when we said we would be done. I appreciate Bob and Quinn. You're saying that we need to get to it and put some proposals out there. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of common ground. It seems to me, one of the things that I was hoping to get to today was having us work in small groups to identify some possible recommendations that we could put forward. And so, maybe what the task is that between now and the next meeting, I mean, folks think about, kind of what along the lines of what Kyle, you put out, just sort of, okay, what are the proposals? And we can have a meeting in December and have a conversation and see if we can make any headway around that and decide at that meeting if it makes sense for the group to continue. I mean, I don't know that it's not my decision. I mean, that's a commissioner decision, but folks are not feeling very hopeful. It seems like we need to give it one more go with some actual proposals and unpack them and stop sort of, tiptoeing around what we each mean by words on a page. Tyler?
I just want to second what Kyle said. I think that would be a really good use of our time, and I'm not ready to give up on this work group. I think that going through each interval and having dialogue with regard to every interval, and the trappers can weigh in, and wildlife services can weigh in, and other environmental groups can weigh in. I think that that is where we should go, and that's really the nuts and bolts of this conversation. I know we were trying to inform the group, but really there may be some good discussion where we actually may find some common ground together, as opposed to, are we just going to say that trapping should or should not continue? No, I'll agree on that, right? So maybe that's where we should spend our time. So maybe a conversation with Bryant in December and discussion pertaining to each individual interval, and if there's wiggle room on that subject or not, I think would be a great use of our time.
Yeah, I would say, a short time with Bryant, because this is the meat, this is the main course that we're trying to get to. So then that puts the onus on everybody on this call to, between now and a December meeting, to really think about, what are some proposals to put forward in light of everything that we've heard so far that we can really unpack and discuss.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should keep going. I wouldn't want to throw in the towel. And I hear your discouragement, Bob, and you've been in the trenches with this for decades, and there's been a lot of disappointments along the way. But, we knew this was going to be hard before we started. And I even got forewarned by our former wildlife administrator that this group would be harder than the beaver group. I was like, no, it's just trap check intervals. He said, wait and see. And so, yeah, I think we need to keep going. And, it's going probably 3 months longer than we thought initially, or that I thought, but I think it's been useful. And I think, as I've said, I want these groups to be able to work together out into the future and not be always, antagonistic toward each other. And so it's like a petri dish of, it's like another pilot to see, how that's going to go. And so I think, the approach of coming back to the trap check intervals, which is why we're here, and having that discussion of 24 hours, 48 hours, that's a way to get people talking again. And so I would agree with that approach.
Thanks for that, Greg. Bob, and then Quinn.
I put in the notes that I agree with that as well. If we get down to the intervals, I think it's worth continuing. If we're going to keep going around on presentations and wordsmithing, then I don't. So, my recommendation would be that we get down to the intervals. I think we've had enough presentations and enough noodling. I think we're already beyond our original expectation for meetings. So I would be supportive of that and happy to continue if we can get there.
I completely agree with that. Bob, Kyle, Tyler, yes, I think let's get down to the core of this discussion. I think that was where some of my frustration was. It's like, let's get to some of these negotiations and actually get into the core of this, what we're supposed to be doing and what our mandate is. To that end, I would be supportive of not having Bryant come talk and just talking about proposals, and possibly even having a longer meeting, because I think having Bryant just kind of lengthens this whole thing, feels like a little bit more delay.
Tyler, you were next.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to defend that presentation because I think it's a possible recommendation that this work group could make. And let's just hear what he has to say. I think that there's no harm in that. I understand the time constraints. We're all sick of these meetings, but I think hearing from the experts as to a potential study so we can actually learn more about our trap check intervals, I think would be prudent. And I don't want to let that one go.
Quinn, would you be okay with it if it was a shorter presentation and we did add a little bit more time on the meeting?
Yeah, I just think we want to have enough time to actually talk about our concerns so that we don't leave frustrated and we have a sense like, okay, we can get this done as a group.
Yeah.
You know, if it turns into an hour-and-a-half conversation and then we don't have time, you know, to look at proposals, I think that's a problem. You know, otherwise, you know, potentially we could see, you know, talk about proposals in December and then see, okay, well, maybe where could Bryant be instructive in what we've come up with in January?
Mhm.
And I just want to echo what Greg said, is that, you know, we want to make sure it's additive and we don't want it to be redundant to what we're supposed to have already read in the BMPs. So if everybody could just read the abstract again, and we can already be light years ahead, and we could probably keep it to a 15-minute conversation with specific questions that we have as to a potential study in Oregon. I think that would be a concise way to do it.
What do you think, Quinn?
Sorry, Jill is raising her hand.
Oh, yeah, I was just curious because Tyler had modified what he was suggesting to just, you know, read the information in advance, have a very short period of time. Jill?
Tyler keeps bringing up the study, and I haven't heard anybody necessarily suggesting that as well. I think that would just delay getting to some sort of decision on this. And I think that I'm fine with having either a very short presentation by Bryant White or no presentation and just moving forward, because it seems like we need to start discussing what we're going to do and you know, lay it out on the table. Who we'll see more clearly who's where, and then be able to, you know, consolidate what we know and a recommendation to the department to the commission. And I'd like to see the department stay as neutral in this as possible, just providing information. Derek was certainly doing that. So the sides are on everybody else involved here. So that's kind of, I don't think we need to move towards supporting more research. And I don't, you know, we haven't voted on that, but I haven't heard anybody else support that. So that's where I'm at.
Susan, and then we need to end because we're at like 4:10.
Okay, I just quickly wanted to say that I support the idea of not having Bryant do a presentation in December, and that, you know, if needed, in January.
Is the only hesitation just the time?
Yeah, it sounds like it's partly the time and partly just, you know, people just want to know where folks are at on these proposals. And that, you know, I think that Quinn's suggestion, what she said is, if we know what the proposals are, we can know where people are at. We know if there's hope for this group to continue, and then Bryant could be helpful, or others could be helpful in looking at, you know, what this group has brought forward and saying, you know, how do we refine this, or what do you think about these choices, or, you know, whatever that is.
I didn't think I was the only one kind of pushing this idea, but if I am, I can yield to the group. Can anybody else speak up if they're not? I guess what I'm trying to say is if there's no other support from this group for Bryant to give a presentation and a potential recommendation to learn more about animal welfare as it pertains to our current trap check intervals, then I'll yield to the group and we don't have to deal with it.
Okay, so who else would be interested to hear from Bryant?
I just want to clarify from Tyler, do you feel that Brian's presentation could help to inform what this next discussion entails? I mean, do you feel that, I mean, that must be the reason why, right? You'd want to have it before.
Right, and well, no, not necessarily, right? I think that it's in some way it's separate, right? The presentation would be getting at a potential study and the feasibility of a potential study, so that I feel like we have something empirical to talk about rather than just the emotions in our head. But maybe he has some insights as to what our trap check intervals ought to be and why. He's a professional after all and has been in the field a very long time.
Okay, yeah, just trying to clarify where you're coming from, Tyler.
Jamie, could I just, I'll weigh in just a little bit.
Go ahead, Kevin, what?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, so, Bryant, really, we asked him a question to try to help demonstrate that that animal welfare concerns are really a key component of the BMPs. That's really what his function was to do there. It wasn't trying to convince one way or another. It was to almost demonstrate how and why through time, through a lot of adaptive research, that the concerns about animal welfare as well as the issues we're grappling with are embedded in the BMPs. So the current trap checks we have are kind of from the ground up. They're based upon some knowledge and science and research. Jamie, if you recall in our conversation with Bryant, we asked him about research particularly on trap injury and trauma, and he said that that's not something he's done before. That's something that would take very specific research design to do, would be very expensive, and you'd really have to determine what it is you're trying to understand and resolve. And so I don't know if he'd be the best resource to do a research design as Tyler wants. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is I know that Bryant is very, he likes being a part of that conversation to help inform agencies and groups, to be familiar with the subject matter. And I'm very comfortable with what Jill said in regards to, if we don't have them right away, we want to talk about some issues, really get to some specifics. I like that idea. And as Jill said, if we get ground in what does it mean, a difference between some other trap checks, we can have him back. He's made himself available to the group to answer some of those questions. So, whether we rush into him next month, I don't think is a critical concern of mine. He certainly is available if it's better to have him at a later date when we're really talking more specific about some timing and types of traps.
Kevin, your hand is up and then we really need to end. So it sounds like we're leaning towards having the December meeting be focused on proposals, looking at the trap check times that we have now, kind of how close or how far apart we are on those, on different proposals, and then taking a step back and seeing, how someone like Bryant or someone else could help to inform those proposals, to tighten them or help us figure out what we want to recommend. So Kevin, your hand is gone. Up there you are.
No, I was just going to say I can defer. I mean, that's Kevin Blakely kind of articulated the point that I was going to make. To me, it was getting to one of those sentences that we were trying to smith, is looking at those things that can reduce those injury and the suffering. So we move to our next discussion and then we can evaluate.
Yeah, so our next meeting is December 7th. Is that right, Bianca?
Yes, that's
we have
right.
a slide to that effect. Our next meeting is December 7th. It's a 2-hour meeting. If we just are focused on proposals, I don't know that we need a longer time, but we could certainly do a poll to see if people want to take a little bit extra time, since we took some extra time today. We also have a doodle poll out about the meetings in January. Most people have completed those. I think about 4 people haven't. So if you can please do that, that would be helpful. And then we were considering a longer in-person meeting in late January, but we can include that in the poll. We don't have to talk about it now. So that way you can let us know what you think about that. And depending on how things go in December, we'll determine, meetings that we might have in January. So the homework for everybody is to, given everything we've heard up to, to date, and knowing what you know about the trap check interval times as they are now, you know, what proposals would you bring forward to the group for the group to consider? And then we'll talk about those. Does that make sense? All right, well, I think we've exhausted ourselves for today. Thanks everyone for staying a little bit longer. I recognize these are just, you know, these are really challenging conversations. People have been with this for like Greg said, decades, you know, some of you, you know, there's a lot of, it's just a really challenging topic. So we'll, you know, we're just doing, I think we're all doing the best we can, and we'll see where we land in December. It's okay, Quinn. We could all use a smile at the end of the meeting. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for sticking it out this long. Thanks to our watching public. This is probably a challenging meeting to observe, but we're trying to get to the conversations we need to have. So I look forward to seeing y'all in December. Of course, if you want to follow up with me after the meeting, I'm always open, and we'll see what we can get done in December.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks.